My guest today is Dan Gramza. He's got a great video he does every day on moneyshow.com, and we're going to talk to him today about some of the things he talks about in that video. And Dan, one of the things you've talked about recently is kind of being able to get a read of the market's emotions and sentiment just by looking at the chart and those bars and kind of knowing what traders are feeling by that. How do you do that?
Tim, it's a very interesting observation that you're making, actually, and my feeling about that is this. When I look, and I'm using primarily a candle chart in those videos that you mentioned. The way I look at that is that the bodies, if it's green, it represents buying. If it's red, it represents selling. A shadow on the bottom represents buying, and a shadow on the top represents selling. Now, the size of it tells us something about the degree of commitment, tells us something about the degree of momentum that we're seeing in the market. So, the observation that you made there, that you just mentioned, is, I think the way we can see that is the lack of commitment. And here's what I mean by that. And when we see a directional play, we'll see a bias to the market typically. So if the market's going down, we should see fairly consistent selling through that market. And certain size of bodies, for example, you don't want them too big, actually. You know, people want these gigantic moves, and you don't want those instantly. If a market goes vertical, it's not sustainable. It's going to have to stop and take a breath. It can move a big distance, but long term, it's not necessarily going to be sustainable. Now that's true for a 1 minute chart to a daily chart, a 5 minute chart, a weekly chart. Same principles apply. But let's talk more specifically about what you're talking about. How do we see indecision? And we see that indecision when we don't see that level of directional commitment. So an example of it, well, the behavior that I'm looking for, and we have some markets that are in that kind of mode, are where we see smaller bodies, where we see shadows on both sides, which tell us that both buyers and sellers are present. There's no strong imbalance to the market, and the result is we are in a balanced phase, which means we're going to go sideways. Because for a market to move, it typically moves from imbalance to balance. And we have a number of markets that are in that imbalance phase, actually, because they need a reason to do something, and they're not sure what to do.
Give us a good example. What's the primary one you see kind of in that phase?
Gosh, Canadian dollar, silver, natural gas. Now, it's a wider area, but natural gas is in that phase. $4 to $5 is what we expect through the end of the year. We're not looking for any real strong, dramatic moves in that market.
And so then do you move to other markets that are more volatile, or will you put on some sort of spread trade that benefits from that kind of channel of trading?
Tim, that's a good thought there. You're right. We could wrap all kinds of ideas around that. If we feel a market is in this indecision area, we could sell option premium, which is a way to take advantage of time decay. And we'd want to sell options that are about 3 weeks to go to expiration, because that's when theta or time decay, does kick in. So those would be maybe at the money or slightly out of at the money options, because they also have the greatest degree of time decay during that period. So we could look at that. We could also, if we feel it's approaching an area that we expect it to move, then you and I could look at straddles or strangles or something that takes advantage of volatility. And maybe we're seeing, and when it comes to the sideways market, I think some other things that are helpful for us is what is typical. Is this typical? The movement that we see now in the markets I just mentioned to you, how big is this sideways move? How long does it typically last? When it leaves, how does it leave? And actually, when it begins, what usually starts that kind of a phase for a market? And I think there's very specific behaviors that can create that.
Dan, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
You're watching the moneyshow.com video network.